Okay, welcome to In the Adirondack Library, the Adirondack Experience's new virtual book series featuring recently published books about the North Country. I'm Jenny Ambrose, the museum's Director of Archives and Special Collections. Thank you for joining us for the second program in the series, which will explore Adirondack life, history, and culture through the work of a diverse group of regional authors. Oops. Right. All of the books in the series will join thousands of other books about the Adirondacks lining our library shelves. You're invited to join us every month on Monday evenings throughout the fall and winter for conversations with our authors. Books in the series are available at the museum's gift shop and at your local public library. A full schedule, as well as information about the books and authors, are available on our website, theadkx.org. The museum is delighted that Mitch Tyke, station manager of North Country Public Radio and host of Northwards, has agreed to conduct the author interviews for the series. His weekly show, Northwards, features conversations with people from around the North Country about what makes living here special and unique. Enjoy Mitch's thoughtful, engaging interviews during the museum's monthly Monday night book programs and in episodes of his podcast every Friday afternoon. We are joined this evening by Tim Kaine, author of American Vistas, The Life and Art of John Van Alstine, and the subject of his work, sculptor John Van Alstine. This pairing of writer and artist provides a wonderful opportunity to examine John's 50-year career with the two leading experts on his work. Tim Kaine, an award-winning journalist, has covered numerous topics from business to the arts for over 30 years. For the last 2 decades, he has focused on visual culture, writing reviews and features on artists for various publications, while also teaching American Studies at Empire State College. John Van Alstine creates abstract sculptures forged with stone and steel. His work has been exhibited widely in the United States, including more than 45 solo exhibitions, as well as in Europe and Asia. 3 of his sculptures, as well as one of his drawings, are in the Adirondack Experience's permanent collection. 2 pieces are currently on view on the grounds and in the museum's new exhibition, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild. The book, American Vistas, highlights and offers a critical assessment of John's art. It delves into biographical elements that drive John's creative process. It is the first evaluation of his work to connect him with the American landscape. This evening, Tim and John will provide you with a beautifully illustrated introduction to the book and John's sculpture. Their presentation will be followed by an interview with Mitch. Please feel free to submit your questions about the book or John's career at any time using the Q&A feature. We will post links and other useful information in the chat section. And now I'll turn the virtual podium over to Tim and John. Please welcome this evening's speakers.
Hello.
I'm going to try to share my screen here. Hold on, Tim. Second. Are we seeing that?
I am.
Indeed, we are.
All right, great. Thank you. Take it away, Tim.
All right. Excellent. This is, again, I want to thank the Adirondack Experience for this opportunity to share the insights from this recently published book. It came out last winter. And I think the title, well, I don't think, the title of it is A Return to the Adirondacks and a Move Towards Pure Landscape. The Adirondacks as a Muse for John Van Alstine's sculpture and drawings from the book American Vistas. American Vistas covers a much wider net in connecting him with the American landscape tradition. But I felt it appropriate to really focus on the interaction that he gets from the Adirondacks for this particular presentation. And it is quite a bit, actually, a crescendo of his career. I came from experiencing and living in the Adirondacks. But first, I want to start things off with a little housekeeping on how this book came about. American Vistas is an outgrowth of John Van Alstine's Catalogue Raisonné, John Van Alstine Sculpture, 1971-2018, published by the Artist Book Foundation in 2019. The basis for American Vistas is a substantial amount of research done for the book, but not included in it. And it's more biographical than John Van Alstine, 71-2018, which focuses on the aesthetics and the art of John Van Alstine's cultural production in its entirety. It is as much about John Van Alstine's life as his art and how external events and circumstances influence the direction of his creativity. And it's also re-examination of the process and mindset at various stages of career based on hundreds of interviews over nearly a decade, along with archival materials. From the 70s on, Van Alstine has had numerous reviews, been recognized with a plethora of distinguished awards, fellowships, residencies, and even a small book published in the 90s entitled Bones of the Earth, Spirit of the Land. So it wasn't that he'd gone unnoticed when we started working on sculpture in 1971 to 2018, otherwise known as the first book. An American, and from my perspective, something was missing in previous interpretations. I researched and developed the first book and wrote one of two main essays in the first book. As I was working on it, I began to see JVA, John Van Alstine, we call him JVA, and his art in different terms. Through his personality, perspective, and attitude, I started to see someone who fit perfectly with other American landscape artists and their experience. It was a whole new way to look at him. American Vistas recast John Van Alstine's art in a significant way in the American landscape movement. This is particularly 19th century, the spawning of this, but it can carry on into the 20th century. This particular discussion more narrowly looks at critical impact that the Adirondacks had on his body of work after he purchased his current studio and home in Wells, New York in the late 80s and moved in full-time in the early 1990s. And first, I think, let's do a little biographical information on John, because this is important, the biographical kind of element that we bring to this book. John was born in Johnstown, New York, not far from the ADK Park. Van Alstine's career has taken him to Wyoming, New York City, Ohio, Maine, the Finger Lakes region, New York, and abroad. Along the way, he instinctively interpreted the environment around him. Part of this was due to his upbringing. Even before he was an artist with formal training as a young competitive skier, he would interact. He remembers being attracted to stone formations on mountain trails, elaborate stone fences lining rural highways, and the white Vermont marble quarries during his ski trips with his family. He grew up in a DIY environment in a solidly middle-class company town with friends and neighbors pitching in on each other's projects. He particularly remembers building his family's summer cottage in the late 1950s and was introduced to boating at an early age. Working with his hands is second nature to him, given Van Alstine's athleticism. His family thought he would become a physical education teacher, but his hands and mind took him to a few art classes in high school at St. Lawrence and later Kent State. All of these influences will impact his later sculpture. Now, back to JVA. and the American landscape. And here's a part where really 4 elements of me interpreting and laying it out of what the thesis is, if you will. For nearly 50 years, John Van Alstine has created abstract sculptures forged with stone and steel. At their essence, they explore natural forces and man-made elements, conveying the American experience as the confluence and conflict between wilderness and industrialization. Ever since the early 19th century, as the nation moved west, landscape artists have depicted this juxtaposition as a particular American dichotomy, a friction between the march of economic progress and the vast expanse of open space, the Garden of Eden spoiled by modernity and machinery. Van Alstine's sculpture adds to the second epic dialogue by expanding on the 19th century narrative while injecting 20th century ideas of extraction, constructivism, cubism, assemblage, collage, and found objects as a standard bearer for the modernist tradition. And finally, he has been described as a abstract artist with keen sense of composition in modernist terms, a sculptor who finds balance and energy in the moment, and an artist who invokes narratives from inanimate objects, or even a figurative artist with implied ideas of the human form. Of all those descriptions are accurate, but analyzing work and life in its totality, a more encompassing definition emerges, one that places his objects and life in the greater context of American art and landscape. And how does he do this? Well, with found stone as a foundation through all his creative phases, much like American landscape artists' depiction of geological forms, John Van Alstine is first and foremost American landscape artist in the tradition that spawned American culture in earnest during the 1830s, known as the Hudson River School. They saw wilderness as unique to the young nation's experience. They believed stone was the bedrock of American culture, America's own ancient ruins rivaling Europe's remnants of civilization. For both Van Alstine and the early American landscape artists, rock formed by geologic movements over time, over millions of years, are timeless and also of the moment expressions of nature and culture. With steel, John Van Alstine introduced industrialization onto this timeline, much like earlier landscape artists who incorporated factories, skyscrapers, railroads, interspersed with wilderness as commentaries on American society as it modernized. It would be years before the Adirondacks would play a key role in his landscapes. So it's important to take a look at 2 earlier periods to understand his trajectory towards the landscape in the 70s and 80s. One was when he was out west in the Rockies and Wyoming, and the other in the New York City area. 2 very different places, diametrically opposed. These phases laid the foundation for understanding how the Adirondacks became central to his artistic production. Anybody have any questions at this point before we head out west?
I would jump in with a question if I might, Tim, and it kind of gets at the intersection of the biographical sketch you shared about John and where he is in this idea of landscape artists. And I guess, John Van Alstine, the question I have for you is, who were the influential people that took you from this kind of DIY growing up in the shadow of the Adirondacks, playing football and skiing, and convinced you that you could make something with your hands that represented this idea of landscape? Who were the influential people that turned you into a sculptor?
Well, I should say that I'm a product of a liberal arts education. I started at St. Lawrence. I thought I was going to be a gym teacher. I was a skier, but I wanted to take a ceramics class. And so I went to Mike Lowe, who was teaching then. And I asked him, he said, "Oh man, you're only a freshman. You'll never get in. it's all upperclassmen, and they'll, they're there because it's an easy A. But he said, if you want to do clay, why don't you sign up for sculpture? Because we not only do clay, but you get to weld and cut stone and do all these things. Well, that was a major turning point in my whole life, and it started me off. I realized, as good a school as St. Lawrence was, it wasn't the art school that I needed. So I looked at some other programs, ended up at Kent State. And there are a number of artists along the way that have impacted me. One, certainly David Smith, who's I realized as I was going through Kent, actually was from Lake George, Bolton Landing, and his abstract welded steel. And you combine that with another American-Japanese sculptor, Isamu Noguchi, who specialized in really letting the stone speak, the nature in stone speak through his sort of Japanese roots. You put those two works together and you have basically John Van Alstine. So as Tim expressed, really my work now, because I use found stone and steel, it's sort of a dialogue or a marriage, an amalgam of Eastern and Western, but it also then reflects on the landscape, sort of the nature and the built environment. I think that's enough to that now.
No, that's true. No, truly interesting. And I'll have more to ask, but I'll let Tim take it back from here.
All right, a pilgrimage out west. Ever since Albert Burstead painted Landers Peak in 1863, the American West has captured the imagination of a nation on the move towards the Pacific Ocean. To cross the Rockies was an American rite of passage with spiritual connotation. Other artists were soon to follow Burstead. This is also true of John Van Alstine. His move to Wyoming and the Rockies in the 1970s was imbued with a sense of the spiritual. The University of Wyoming in Laramie, not far from Landers Peak, with essentially the same topography, hired him as an assistant professor in the summer of 1976 to begin in the fall of that year. Laramie could not have been different than where Van Alstine had come from. Northern forests and rounded older granite peaks gave way to wide open prairie filled with buttes, arches, spirals, and domes. With such a contrast, he became mesmerized with the scenery and in awe of the endless space before him.
And Tim, can I just interject? When I first moved out there, I was just blown away by that space. And I kept walking around almost in a daze, thinking, how can I ever compete with this? It was so overwhelming coming from the Eastern forests and then seeing this incredible landscape spread out before you. And you could see the geology, the layers, and how it was all put together. And and after a while, I was able to digest that in my own way, sort of bring it forward in my work.
Well, you went out, as I recall, with the idea of making this journey, maybe not based on you being an artist in the history of going out west and what Berstadt and others did, right?
I was going out.
You grew up with the kind of the West.
I was going out there because I was hired to teach, and it seemed like a job.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, so now we're going to get to some artwork of this period, and but there's 2 points I want to make here. Layers of sedimentary rock exposed to thousands of years of erosion led him to experience stone as a system, not just as a singular object. That's very important in his trajectory of his work. Lying horizontally or standing vertically, the new works have a stack quality, echoing sedimentary layers of rock in the Western Great Basin. And here are some works, and John, if you want to jump in, and I'll jump in on the works we selected that show this.
We're looking here at slide 9, and there's a shot of the sedimentary stone. It's called Colorado flagstone. And one of the things I started to do was just to pull that stone out and start stacking it and reiterating the sedimentary layers, the way it was actually formed. And the piece on the right here called Stone Pile is actually a system in the sense that it's not welded together, but it's the weight of the stone that pushes down and engages the steel and holds the whole sculpture in place. So in theory, the more you pile on there, the stronger it gets. And so it's a sort of static energy event, definitely a system, and definitely inspired by the stone that was there on that landscape.
And we have here, yeah, okay, sag, and trough and arch, but I see you have different. I'm trying to track where you are a little bit here.
So just the
Yeah,
image
yeah,
now
go
is
ahead.
image 10 or slide 10, and it's because I moved out to this very high prairie, high plains. Everything was horizontal. It was amazing. You could sit there and watch a full train, move across the high plains. It looked like a long moving steel snake. Anyway, my sculpture started to hover low and spread out. Some were pinched together in sort of these peaks, like in prop, or in sag, which is the piece to the upper left. There's some more stone pile pieces here, again, reiterating the geological nature and kind of me responding to the buttes and the towers that were just, mind-blowing for me. So we're up to slide 12, and we've got troughs. Again, it's sort of creating this canyon-like space. Arch 6, I did a whole series of arch pieces that, again, are self-supporting and definitely inspired by the incredible arches that you have out west.
How complete are these sculptures in your mind before you start to interpret them, if you will?
When I was doing these pieces, I had a pretty good idea of where we were going. Unlike what I'm doing now, where it's more of a improvisation, kind of the materials tell you what's going to happen, and it's a little more loose and maybe even a little more fun because you don't quite know where you're going to end up. These were definitely a system, and they had a very calculated size and movement and whatever. In fact, at the end of this series, I felt like I had backed myself into a corner. They were just so rigid. They were important. I got a lot of attention. I was in a major show at the Smithsonian using these works, but I felt like I had done what I set out to do, and I needed to step back. And I think that's where we move. I have an ancillary series. In fact, Tim, why don't you talk about this, the easel landscape, which sort of was an intermediate series that sort of got me thinking about the landscape.
Well, it shows to me, and you're thinking like a landscape artist. You're putting a frame, and that was the traditional way to present it. Yet, you can be an American landscape artist and not have a frame. But I think you were thinking there, the picture and the artist and the self-referential, you call it a lot, right? When you're referring to yourself. And this came in an interesting transitional period, as you just brought up about in a corner, right? And you deviated here. And there's another series, the gallery series, that to me is sort of questioning art. What is landscape? What is an interscape?
Actually, what was happening here is I had backed myself into this corner, and I started experimenting with just steel, not stone, which was unlike me. So I had this whole series of these gallery drawings, one of which ended up in the Denver Museum, which was kind of nice. But one day I was moving this, and I took this easel, which you see against the wall there, which is 6 feet high. I stuck it in the ground while I was loading other parts of the show. I turned around, I looked at it, and I thought, oh my God, that reminds me exactly of the French surrealist René Magritte and this very famous painting called The Human Condition, where you're looking out through his easel, through his canvas, through the window. And it led to a whole series of works where I took this easel all over the place. I welded a frame on the back of my van and piled it on, and everywhere I went, I took this easel and tried to find these images that would kind of question what the landscape was, how we perceived it. You know, the one on the left here, the Teton easel landscape, or the Colorado landscape, I kind of like because you see the footprints and the actual evidence that the artist has been there and plopped it in. It's directing your vision. And it creates an interesting optical illusion as well. That center frame seems to pop out. And you have to understand, these were done in 1979, 1980. This was way before Photoshop, or at least certainly before I had any controls like that. So these are almost like installations in the landscape recorded by the camera. And there's some other ones, the abstract easel landscape done, I think that's in Iowa. You remember, I'm teaching in Wyoming, coming back to New York every summer. And on that long trip, I had made many stops and photographed with my big camera, get everything out. The piece on the right here is the Monet easel landscape, kind of referencing Monet's haystack paintings. This was in Nebraska. They still made haystacks like that. And then I was even a kind of a tongue-in-cheek moment here where I did some self-portraits as a Western artist, and found some crazy things like this giant fiberglass elk that seemed like a perfect thing, or in the upper right-hand corner, just using the Tetons as the background and putting on your shades. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see me actually carrying the easel through the landscape. So anyway, this was a fun kind of digression, I guess, if you will. But then we moved on, and I moved back east, and the urban forums kicked in. So I think that's where we are now, Tim, on 17. Yep. Urban forum period.
And here, John, is, I mean, they're so opposite. Just, you can look here. He's going to this very dense urban, marine detritus of industrialization and New Jersey, and leaving, Laramie. And, this is where actually I think a lot hits the sensibility of the structure of what the urban landscape is in landscape, no less. And there's all this value that he finds in the culture of it, which is very, in the 20th century, very much as urban, cities grew in the country, artists turned to that from actually nature, because it said a lot about us and about where we're going. Again, that conflict. So,
yeah, in fact, just to give a little background, I was out in Laramie teaching at the university for 4 years. I really felt, as much as I loved it out there, I really thought I needed to be back east, and where sort of I felt the center of the art world was. And I was lucky enough to be curated into a major show at the Hirshhorn, which is in Washington, D.C. And as a part of that, people in the Washington area got to know my work. And there happened to be a job opening at the University of Maryland, College Park, which is just outside of DC. And I was hired to teach there. So I came back from growing up in upstate New York, living in Laramie, Wyoming, and then being plopped down in the middle of Washington, DC, in this urban area, which was, crazy, but it paid some real dues. And then finally I moved my studio and bought a building in Jersey City. And what the images you see on the screen now are like the Pulaski Skyway, this crazy bridge that has counterweights with steel. And when you see what work came out of there, you'll see the influences for sure. So, and then there was a moment, still kind of trying to figure out where it was going. I ended up with these pieces called tripods with umbilicals. And they were kind of animated, moving. They still had that steel interlocking. They had the tension, but it was moving away from that very rigid, sort of squared off work that I was doing in Wyoming. And those turned into pieces like you see here, where I came across this huge pile of industrial waste that I was given permission to dig into, and ended up with these big pieces of granite, these pieces of pipe, bent I-beams, and started working on these that are more related to the industrial landscape.
In some strange way, do you feel like you were, when you talk about, going from these kind of rigid systems to more improvisation, is this a little like a classical composer becoming a jazz musician?
Could be, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wanted to have a little more fun. I mean, I love making stuff, but as I said, what I was making, I had said what I wanted to say, and I was searching out new avenues of expression, and but still combining the nature that these are found stone. Earlier in my career, I carved stone. Started out chipping away all the pieces that weren't supposed to be there. And then one day I was working on a piece, it actually fell off the carving table, totally blew my mind. But I realized that looking down on the floor and seeing these beautiful broken pieces, that there was potential there. And I ended up making my first sculpture with quote unquote found stone. And I never looked back. I never sort of went back to carving. I always then started trying to find stone in a more natural way and combining it with steel. So that's where we are.
And there's two words that I wanted, drastic measures, John.
Yeah.
And rock slide, we're coming up to those, and rounder. And to me, this is when you're connecting landscape, in the urban setting.
Mm-hmm.
Those words.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to put
Yeah,
them up,
I
we're
want to say something about the Jersey City. Not only was it industrial, but it was marine. Jersey City's right on the west bank of the Hudson, and I was able to come across all these or several marine salvage yards where there were chains and buoys and cleats, and I was able to put those into my work, as you can see on this number 21 slide, buoy on the right hand side. But then we go into drastic measures and rock slide, and you're right, Tim, that's when we start getting into the sort of more landscape aspects of this particular series. Also, I'll just say the drawing that I have over in the right on the slide, people will often ask me, well, do you draw your sculptures out first? And I don't. The work actually happens on the floor of the studio, putting the pieces together. The drawings often come after or sort of adjunct with ideas, but not real specific, meaning I don't go make a drawing, come up with the idea, make a drawing, and then go out and try to find the parts. That's not, it doesn't work for me. So the sculptures actually act as the subject matter for many of my drawings, and you'll see that in a while.
Do you have to have an intuitive sense of structural engineering, though, to be able to do this?
I think so, yeah. It's like a farmer's intuition. People often ask, gee, do you have an engineer or do you have an engineering background? And actually, I don't, but I've had enough experience that it seems so far so good, things stand up. Now, of course, when you get into the very large scale pieces, and we're not going to really touch on that here, those absolutely have to go through structural engineers. They have to go through zoning and all kinds of things. And in fact, I've had one big piece at the Indianapolis airport, which actually uses a wing from an F-14. When I talked to the engineer on this one, he goes, oh man, this is crazy. We're out here in Indiana. We have tornadoes. This thing not only got billboard pressure, it might tip over, but it's a wing. The thing could like take off. It could be like the Wizard of Oz sculpture. So,
and it's at a terminal at a major airport, so there's public safety.
Yeah, public safety. But anyway, so yes, but these pieces are done in my studio with my St. Lawrence engineering. All right, Tim.
All right. So here we enter the 80Ks and return home. This is really big and a big part of the book. And when we get to the crescendo of him interacting with it, And during the past 30 years, Van Alstine has produced hundreds of sculptures from his studio workspace in Wells, New York, sending them in all directions of the compass to collectors, galleries, museums. Relocating permanently from Jersey City in the early 1990s, Van Alstine describes the Wells studio as a never-ending project that requires constant attention. The site, in essence, is a sculptural project, the largest he's done. This place is, to know anything about John Van Alstine is to know his connection to where he works and has for the last 30 years. And these days, he, with partner Austrian sculptor Caroline Ronsdorfer, the two oversee the property, a nerve center of activities, with its warehouse spaces, galleries, sculpture gardens, displaying works for the numerous visitors that arrive regularly. And renovations by Van Alstine began in the late 90s on the site where milling, tanning, manufacturing took place as far back as the early 1800s, when Lewis and Clark were charting the unknown of the Western frontier. Known most recently as the Adirondack Lumber Company, the mill was the lifeblood for several generations in the central Adirondacks during much of its history. It ceased operations in the late 1960s, falling into serious disrepair.
And I might jump in here. The slide that's up on the left, you can see an old postcard from around the turn of the century. It was a veneer mill then. You can see Routes 30 kind of winding its way up there. When I finally bought it back in 1987, the house that we live in, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, was just a shed. And it was there was no electricity, there was no plumbing, there was nothing. We spent the first summer just, and it took Niagara Mohawk then until late August to actually hook up electricity. So we did a lot of sawing and hammering and listening to the Iran-Contra affair on NPR. But, you know, over 35 years now, it's turned into something pretty special. And we were able to get a New York State historic sign marker out. We did a lot of research, a lot of primary research. And actually, I'll go to the next slide, and you can see actually a little bit of what it looks like. The house now with the sculpture in the upper right there, and then lower left, it looks like today. It was just beautiful. And then, of course, we work all winter here. So I may be the only sculptor that has to go out and shovel snow off the studio floor to keep working. But
so John's connection to the Wells studio began by pure chance. In 1986, he was in Saratoga Springs at the prestigious Yaddo Institute residency. At Yaddo, John Van Alstine was reinvigorated by the natural, quote, natural beauty, calmness, and bucolic feel reminiscent of his youth spent in upstate New York. From there, he drove north on Route 30 to visit St. Lawrence University, which we talked about earlier, where he attended college for 2 years. Passing by the site's dilapidated structures, noticing several for sale signs plastered all over it. While it was incredible in terms of scale and potential, the price was extremely reasonable for a nine-acre complex on the river, but it was a gut rehab. He purchased it in 1987. Most importantly, the place would rekindle his creative fire and move him further towards a pure landscape that firmly ties him most directly to the American landscape genre.
and Tim, maybe I can jump in here. Sort of what happened.
Please.
What happened was, you know, there was so much work to do on the studios that there was no place or no time really to do sculpture. So I started working on drawings, and you know, I hadn't had a lot of experience with drawing, mostly black and white. But one of my business partners owed me a bunch of money, and he said, gee, I've got this big thing of pastels. How about I trade you these box of pastels for the money I owe you? I go, oh, no, I don't know. But anyway, it turned out a pretty good thing because I was able to sort of slowly work my way into color and really make it come alive. And some of these images, these drawings done in 1987. That very first year that we were in Wells, I was able to peel away some time and start doing these images. They ended up being vessel forms. I mean, you know, we're right here on the river. I'd been to the Adirondack Museum, which what it was called then, and was very impressed with the boat forms that we saw in the boat pavilion. You know, and that, along with my growing up in Croga Lake and the sailing and the boating, it sort of just came through. And then, of course, boats and vessels are much more than just boats and vessels in art. They really are metaphors for passage or for movement one way or the other. So, and there were many of these pieces that came out that year. This one is actually the next summer of '88, East River Passage. We live on the East Branch of the Sacandaga. That particular piece on the left belongs to the Adirondack Museum. And then East River Passage 2, which is more of a, I don't know what, Drums Along the Mohawk or something there. And then some other vessel pieces taking off. River on Fire, it's a combination of my interest in the river here, but also spending time in Kent, Ohio. I was close enough to Cleveland, where, if you remember, the Cuyahoga River caught fire and caused all kinds of craziness. And then Lunar Passage, 1988, kind of thinking, I think Halley's Comet was happening around then, 87, 88. So I was thinking that way. Anyway, brings us back to the real landscape, or the landscape for the Adirondacks, and its kind of influence. So we're up to 31 and talking about the rock slides.
Yes. Well, one striking thing is there's a move towards color, right, John?
Yep.
And the rock slide series really is, I mean, I see a lot of sublime here in this part when he really is feeling the Adirondacks with the vessel motif or whatever he's doing. Rock slide series is castellating stone, crushing steel structures with full force of nature. You can see water gushing in Round Mountain Rushing Water 2001, and Rounded Mountains of the Adirondacks are sublimely reflected in Round Mountain Landscape, an obvious title. Geologic fissures and sliding plates in midriff and fault line. And you can imagine.
Hold on 1 second. I want to just talk just a second about, we're on slide 33, Round Mountain Rushing Water, and then Round Mountain Landscape. So the piece on the right, Round Mountain Landscape, I was happy enough to photograph it right in front of the Round Mountain here in my studio. And you can see how that green, soft, arching green form echoes the round, soft mountains of the Adirondacks. Very, very different than the Rockies in general. And also you can see I'm moving back to the granite that's more local and here in the East, not using that sedimentary stone. But we do move into a piece like midriff, and then, which is kind of geological moving plates, and then fault line, which is 2014, a bit later. But at this point, I'm starting to use slate that I find over on the New York-Vermont border. In fact, it was sort of a move of necessity. I was using granite for years, and I used to be able to go to the quarries in Barre, Vermont, and they would just let you in with your truck and your crane and go, "Oh yeah, here's John, he's the crazy sculptor. Oh yeah, take whatever you want." Well, the quarry was sold to a big corporation, and they put a big stop to that. So I was out of my source of stone, and I had to find a new place to look. And someone said, "Hey, there's a lot of slate over near Granville. You can just go pick it up." And that's what I've been doing. So slate has its own characteristics. It has its ridges and layers. It's a lot more difficult to work. It's more fragile, but it has its characteristics.
Can I jump in? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, please. No, go ahead.
I was just looking back, in fact, looking at storm warning now, but then looking back at midriff in the previous slide. When you're putting together a sculpture that will be exposed to the elements, do you consider how the sculpture itself will interact with elements like snow or rain?
Yes. Mostly water and freezing. That's the big issue with stone. If you drill a hole and catches water and it's out there in the frost, believe it or not, as the water expands, it's strong enough to split the granite. And I've had that happen a couple times. And in fact, in the old days, that was one way they used to split stone. They used to set a big granite thing up, drill all these holes, have the rain fill it, let it sit over the winter, and sure enough, it would split. It's a slow process that way. So they used lots of other ways, but that was one way. Also, outdoors, a lot of my work has steel, so that it has to be prepared in a certain way so it doesn't rust. I have it galvanized and then powder coated sometimes. Another way that I work is actually using bronze and having the steel elements cast in bronze and then welded together and then assembled with the stone. So, but let's move on to the landscape storm warning pieces here, Tim.
One of my favorites.
Yeah.
Well, you feel, you see it, a thunderstorm coming across to me. I mean, and I love the arching that you do to get that trail, that cloud. You look and there's a storm down the road and and it's kind of sheets of it where your perspective is, and this thing is coming at you like a train. So
the one thing that I've tried to do in all of my work, and I know we're just seeing a real small slice of it, but to try to get stone up in the air and kind of choreograph it, kind of make it defy gravity. And so I get these pieces of slate, which are already that are dark and ominous, and they have these kind of layers that to me look like cloud formations. You get them up in the air, and it's sort of pressing down. It's like, it's coming at you. And of course, in a sculpture, you need a way to hold it up. So the idea of this rain that comes down that you see on the landscape, this isn't obviously an Adirondack landscape, but when I was out west, I would see these amazing storms move across the prairie, and they would just come down, and they felt like they were being held up by the rain. And in a way, that's what I'm trying to reiterate or capture in these storm warning pieces.
Well, storm warning and red rain too. We should talk a little about your subtle, I guess, stealthy environmental message. You're certainly not screaming. Well, maybe I don't. You're certainly aware of it. Why don't you share with us sort of? You've had series, you have Prixis, right, that talks about a ship out of course, or is a group, as a community globally. But you're not shouting it, are you? Or am I incorrect in that?
No. In this piece that we see, it's on the slide now, it's got the red rain, thunderhead. It's similar to the works that we saw before, but the red not only that gives it a visual sort of kick for the sculpture, but it also is symbolic in the sense that it's red meaning like bad, like acid rain. We all went through the acid rain periods here in the Adirondack. So it's a stealthy environmental statement that we need to sort of be aware of and that take notice. And Tim is right. Later we'll even see some of the Prixis Arise series, which has a vessel form, very much influenced by the Adirondacks, but is much more than just a boat in a sculpture. We'll talk about that in a minute. And here's another one, Twister. That's definitely not the Adirondacks up in the lower left, but I did like that photograph because it captures the twisting activity that's going on in the sculpture.
And one thing I think, and we have it here, I'll just tell you guys that John is I lost my train of thought.
Right.
But he we'll go on. We'll go on to that.
Let's go on to the river, because the river is the huge...
Well, we're getting there, yeah.
Yep.
But
Yep.
color, John. Sorry, excuse me.
Yep.
Color in the Adirondacks is where you really, right? I look at it now more and back again, kind of getting this presentation together. And you were pretty kind of monochrome for a lot, right? Even in the big hair days,
Yep.
right? Just natural stuff. Can you describe your process?
Actually, the image that's up on the center image now of course, with that beautiful autumn landscape, that really influenced some of my pastel drawings. You know, you have the colors, those earthy colors, and then you have the branches that create those dark sort of skeleton spines. And if you look at my drawings, often they have a very strong structure using the charcoal. But that sort of bled into my sculpture, where you're always trying to come up with a way to protect the steel from rusting. So painting is one way, painting it more than one color, adding a whole variety of colors. I experimented with that quite a bit over the years, and we'll see one or two of those in a minute. But the river, you know, that runs, this is the one in the center, is right in front of our house. And the one to the right is Auger Falls, just upstream about 5 miles. Wonderful, amazing waterfall that you got to be careful of, as Tim and I know, as we were walking there way back when we first started working on this book. Tim brought
2009. I mean, you know, like, well, that's an interesting story. Author and subject together. Was early March, not a lot of snow, icy, chippy, and we went up an auger, and we went with my dog at the time, Faith. She slipped, went into the auger of this machine, and never saw her again. Just gone. We tried to call the park ranger. We went up, and I nearly fell. I was hanging back. If you remember, we had snowshoes on, and I got caught in a tree, and I'm going that way. We searched, and we never found it. It's just that the power of that. It just sucked her and gone. Boom.
Yeah. So the river,
we have running jokes about, you know,
the river gives and takes.
And the river, all that we get biblical, right, John? You know, in this, the river gives, the river taketh away. Anyway, that was 2009, huh? Wow.
Yeah. But anyway, there were a number of works that sort of came out of, well, influenced by the river. These are longer, lower landscapes, kind of falling over rocks, whatever, and kind of sliding out. Here's a piece called Sacandaga River Landscape. Here's one called Mountain River Landscape. Auger, definitely influenced by Auger Falls. And if you haven't been to Auger Falls, it gets its title, as you might imagine, because the water, it's a very long waterfall, and it has a sort of spinning auger effect. And it's not only beautiful, but it can be very powerful, especially in the winter time. So, and then, this is one of my fun pieces. Let me talk about this. It's called River Angler. And as you can see in the lower right, I'm going to try to turn the video on. All right, there it is. Look out.
Oh, John, you did it. You put it in, didn't you? Okay. All right.
So I'm a avid fly fisher person, and the piece River Angler 2015 that you see on the slide tries to capture in the steel, the hardness of steel, but yet the fluidity of the forms, this the beauty of casting. So one more way that the landscape, living in the Adirondacks, has influenced my work.
And right outside the frame is usually a couple lawn chairs right there where we sit.
Yep.
And in fact, we kind of, when the book started the first book in 2010, we sitting there on a beautiful summer day, glistening, and we're sitting in lawn chairs having a beer. And, you know, John goes, you know, we started talking, and yeah, we agree. Every artist needs a writer, and every writer needs an artist. And that, in earnest, sort of started it. It took a couple of years to start really doing it, but aside for some preliminary stuff. So anyway, it's a very comfortable place to be.
How did the two of you first connect?
Oh, that's a good question. Tim, I think it was because you were writing for the Times-Union, and I had a piece at the Beijing Olympics along with Caroline Romersdorfer, my lovely wife. We both had works there, and you somehow got wind of it, I think, and then you called up and said you wanted to come visit and talk, and that was sort of our first meeting, and then it kept growing from there, and it's turned into quite a beautiful relationship.
Yeah, we did a big had a cover of the art section thing. I'd heard about him from Jim Richard Wilson at Polka Gallery. Had just come up recently. We used to meet. He says, "You got to check this place out. You got to check this guy out." And looked on it and said, "Well, this is really interesting stuff." And went up to cover him. So did a story, and that was we kept in touch.
Look what happened. Amazing, huh?
Yeah.
So here talking about color. So this was experimenting with color. This is my Blue Mountain landscape, I guess, inspired by Blue Mountain Lake in the Adirondacks. Another piece called Diagonal Tendencies. These are both slate and steel. And it's kind of interesting to paint the stone. It's kind of, you're not sure if it's real or no, you know, whatever. And it's a very flat sign paint called, and it's very interesting when it's on stone. So I don't do this very often, but when I do, it seems interesting, at least to me. And then we move into the real vessel forms. This is definitely inspired by the Adirondack Museum now, the Adirondack Experience. And as I said before, I've always been interested in boats, and it ended up during COVID making, well, actually, this is a piece that came in 2011 that's was commissioned at Tsinghua University in Beijing. It's one of the largest of the vessel sort of passage pieces. It's interesting. The project here for Tsinghua was they were celebrating their 100th anniversary as a university, and they commissioned 100 sculptors to have works on campus. Amazing. 50 were Chinese, 50 are American, and we sent over our models. There were maybe 1,500, 2,000 applicants, and it was selected down, and I was in the 50 non-American, non-Chinese, and so was Caroline. So this is the piece that came out. And then that sort of morphed into the Praxis Arise series, which worked on during COVID. And again, the vessel form here is much more than just a boat. The title Praxis is a constellation, which is the mariner's compass. And if your ship's compass is awry, your boat, your vessel, your group of people are sort of launching off into maybe not the best place. And I certainly felt that was going on during COVID, both politically and however else. So then I created 45 of these Praxis Arise pieces since 2020 and still counting. In fact, I just finished another one. The boat forms might be interested. It's basically a bronze brass tubing that I cut to sections and then heat up, pinch down, and then slice open, almost like slicing open a piece of fruit or something. And you get, if you do it right, you get these beautiful vessel forms.
I'm curious if I can interject, and I know we're starting to run low on time, and I'll remind folks that we do have a little bit of time to take a question or two if you have them. Feel free to put them in the Q&A. But you were just talking about you've worked together, Tim and John, for it sounds like 14 years on your projects, the two books, and I guess I'm curious. John, does going through this process lead you to view your own work in new ways when you actually have to kind of talk out loud about it and be able to present it to Tim in a way that allows Tim to present it to the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I've always been pretty good about talking about my work. It kind of comes from being a university professor, but writing about it is another thing. And one thing this project has really helped me, and actually Tim has helped me a lot too, is, getting things down on paper. Our process was basically interviews where Tim would come or we'd be together and Tim would record it. And then he'd pose the question back to me with and ask me to clarify it or pick out the best parts or the best questions and clarify it. And so that really made me sit down and think about how to put this down on paper to convey your thoughts meaningfully. And it really helped me a lot. And so I'm not sure that answers your question, but it made me a better writer, that's for sure. Yeah. And I think Tim may be a better viewer of at least my sculpture, huh, Tim?
Yeah, no, I learned a lot as well. It was great to see John kind of reconnect and go, aha, a lot, right, John?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
really, I never would have thought of that. And that was a great feeling. And obviously these are my 2 books I've done, the long form, ultimate long form. So obviously to put that together and in a catalog form, with all the details and the cataloging and all that goes on, it was for me, project management at the advanced level.
Well, John, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just I have one more thing. You asked me if it made me view my work differently, and certainly Tim, framing the work in the landscape. Yeah, I've sort of thought of myself landscape, influence, but not the way Tim has been able to put it together and has really framed it in a way that I think is not only good for me, but for people in general. I mean, there's a whole aspect of figure in my work, or tools or implements or the large scale or navigation. So this is, a book on seeing my work in the landscape. I guess our next book will be what, Tim? Navigation or celestial or some other.
Desolation Lake.
All right.
Well, John, I have to say, this will date me in some strange way, but as someone who grew up in the Washington, D.C. area and went regularly on field trips in probably 6th and 7th grade to the Hirshhorn, I wish it had been at a time when you were actually there to explain to me, because I think I would have had a much greater appreciation for the stuff that they showed us, because this has been a true eye-opener, and you're both so good at talking about this.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
And I don't know if you had final words to wrap up this presentation, and then I think we turn things back over to Jenny Ambrose.
I have the last slide up is just photographs of the garden as we see it now. For people who might be interested, if they want to come visit, we're happy to give tours. Just give us make an appointment either by emailing or texting me. You can find that information on the website. We have large scale and small scale works. So we're not only in the business of showing and telling, we're in the business of selling. So if you got that special thing you want to come visit us, I'm sure we can find you something. So that being said, we can turn it over.
Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful program. We appreciate you being on the series. So we invite you to come back on November 5th when we will feature the next book in the series, The Black Woods: Pursuing Racial Justice on the Adirondack Frontier by Amy Godine. Amy will discuss her latest research into the history of 19th century Black communities and pioneers in the Adirondacks. To learn more about the Black Woods, an article about the book is available in the October issue of Adirondack Life magazine. There's a link in the chat. And to register for the Black Woods program, there's a link in the chat, or visit the ADKX website. A reminder, the full schedule for our monthly programs and information about the books and authors is available on our website. We'll see you next month.